All right. Welcome to Conversations with Catholics. I am joined today by Dry Apologist. Um, Caleb, I am very excited to talk to you today. I've recently gotten into some of your work, and I say recently because the amount of stuff that you've put out on YouTube over the past couple of years is awesome. Not just the amount, but the quality. The kinds of people that you've spoken to over the past couple of years is super, super cool. Just earlier today, I was listening to you talking with John Buck, Danny, and with Ben from the Relay Theology team. And I just think it's super cool that you have these kinds of conversations. When I when I do word associations with those three people that I just mentioned, the word apologist doesn't normally come up, but the word apologist appears in your name. So how did you wind up using the label apologist? And just tell me about your name, I guess, Dry as well. Where did Dry Apologist come from?
Yeah. Well, I'm going back and forth on like whether I should change my name. I mean, I don't have like a huge following, so I don't think it'll matter that much, but I'm kind of just stuck with it because I'm fun with it. But
You have a big enough following because you've got a fan. SJ said, "Yippee, I like Caleb." So you've got enough of a following that you've got some fans. So uh, but tell me more about it. So
yeah.
you just kind of picked it.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it's because like I don't want to put myself out like I'm like a scholar or something, call
Hmm.
myself a philosopher, theologian, and people are like, "Oh, where'd you do your PhD?" or something. It's like, well, I'm just like a random guy, So I don't. So part of it was just to kind of be more humbling because like it's not, I don't really consider like apologist like be a prestigious term. So it was like, but I also want to let people know like yeah, that is what I'm talking about is like things related to like I do take a stance. I am defending my Christian beliefs, but at the same time, I recognize it can be a pejorative label from some people, but I don't think it has to be. So I'm like, well, if we can do a good job at apologetics, it doesn't have to be a pejorative label. So even though maybe a lot of people aren't doing it honestly, or or aren't doing a good job, but I mean, it doesn't mean that everybody has to be doing it that way. So it's kind of for all of those reasons. And then the dry part, I was just trying to come up with a catchy like 2 word and I'm not saying it's that catchy, but it was like, well, I tend to have a more mellow, like dry or whatever deadpan kind of personality. So it was like, well, I just thought that was something that rolled off the tongue and made enough sense to my mind.
Cool, cool. Yeah, no, I like it. I like it. Um, I what you said right there about apologetics, I think is interesting. Maybe 2 weeks ago, I did an interview on the show James's interviews, um, and James actually was Catholic, and in the episode that I appeared on, he made the announcement on his channel saying that he doesn't call him like he said that he's not Catholic anymore, but he's also not Catholic anymore. So I and that's similar to kind of what I say about myself, I suppose, like culturally Catholic, I suppose, but not practicing Catholic by most definitions of the term. You just called yourself Christian in your description. You said that you're a Christian apologist. Just I'm gonna ask you to put your cards on the table. You're Catholic, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm Catholic. I mean, like Catholic Christian aren't at odds in my
No.
mind, of course. But if and I guess the reason why I say Christian is if I say Catholic, typically that will come to mind like I focus more on like Catholic doctrines, and as you would set up there, like yeah, my content tends to focus more on like philosophy of religion, Christian doctrines. I mean, I have done some discussions and debates and things on Catholic doctrine, but that's not what I tend to focus on. That's why I'm probably more naturally call myself a Christian apologist, though I do defend Catholic beliefs, and yeah, I am a Catholic.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, when you describe yourself as a Catholic, um, I think it's so obviously there's Catholics are not a monolith, right? Um, so the kind of Catholic that I grew up traditionalist Catholic, is I'm going to say very opposed to critical scholarship, like the kind of scholarship done, or at least the kind of scholarship discussed by people like Camille Gregor. You posted a video a few months ago with Camille Gregor talking about things like the empty tomb, and just like, the historicity of certain, like, pericopes in the gospel and stuff like that. Um, and you just seemed totally unfazed by that. Like you were just like, yeah, that's cool. I don't have to um, accept the historicity of certain select things in order to remain Catholic. And you're in good company too. So my pretty much my favorite New Testament scholar, Father Raymond Brown, Catholic priest until the day that he died. What's up, Rosemary? Um, and likewise, he was unfazed by that kind of stuff. That stuff phased me a lot, clearly, when I was coming out of religion. But at some point, you learned about this and you weren't phased by it in the slightest. So I'm interested to hear about your kind of take on like the historicity of the Gospels and what that means to you as a Catholic.
Yeah, and that discussion with Camille was actually one of the first discussions I had on my channel. I had lost some of my content. I retrieved that video, so I reposted it, but that's why it's flagged as more recent. But I still stand by the content in that discussion. But anyways, I just wanted to clarify that. But yeah, I mean, I'm not really bothered by a lot of the biblical scholarship stuff because honestly, like coming to peace with maybe not everything in the Bible has to be totally historically accurate brought me more peace because when you find some stuff like in the Old Testament, it's like, I hope some of this isn't historically accurate. Like, so, I mean, I'm coming across like traditional Catholics and like there was stuff and I would agree with like doctrinally what they were saying, but then when it came to like some of these like Old Testament passages, I was hoping they would take a more softer approach to them. And it was like, oh yeah, that stuff happened. We take everything in the Bible as like inerrant in this like really strong way and stuff. And it was like, okay, like maybe there's a way out of this. Like, because I mean, my impression of growing up was like Catholicism isn't like I think a lot of people have this impression that like the Catholic Church is more liberal or moderate about biblical inerrancy, and I think that that is growing over the last 100 years or so as it's become more open to biblical scholarship, and like that's taken root more. But like traditionally, the Church has taken kind of a strong biblical inerrantist view, and I'm okay with development of doctrine. There are things that like the Church has developed in doctrine, but I mean, even now, like more conservative Catholics who are involved. I mean, most people don't know about the issue one way or another, but the people who are involved in apologetics and theology and they're on like the strongly conservative side are going to still, at least in my experience, defend like this really inerrantist picture of the Bible. And like to me, that's like more destructive than just saying, well, maybe it's not all historically accurate, but maybe God is still communicating these central truths of salvation and morality. And like, sure, there's some murkiness about things like, but also just at a common sense level, if you're approaching the Gospels, like they are different. Like they do record Jesus saying apparently the same conversation in different ways. Now I've heard it be argued like, well, maybe he said it the same thing at different times, and these are actually different. Like once you go down that territory, if like you're giving the impression that that's what's needed to maintain your faith, like I mean, like to me that like is almost like defending like young earth creationism and flat earthism, and like it's just yeah, you can do anything if you try hard enough. You can make a coherent system, but it's completely implausible, and like nobody's gonna buy this. Like you're just like lying to yourself at some point. So it's like if that's what's needed, then why don't we just get rid of? Why don't we just soften our stance? And honestly, that's the direction the Church I think has been going in. Like I have this book. So the Pontifical Biblical Commission about 7 years ago released this book, and I think it has the imprimatur, and it takes a fairly moderate, some would say very liberal perspective on biblical inerrancy. And it's like, yeah, the Bible can have errors about history and such. And again, it's not an official like church document, but this was like approved by the church.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a lot of people are just like unaware of this stuff. So they just,
Yeah.
they repeat old documents. And then they were like, oh, well, this is what the church said. And it's like, yeah, it did. But the church also develops on documents. And I don't see it as a problem when more evidence comes to light, like regarding evolution or regarding whatever it might be, there can be development of doctrine. It's just you have to take into consideration, like, okay, like some doctrines I don't think should develop in certain ways. Like we couldn't jettison the Trinity or the Incarnation. Like these are core doctrines, but biblical inerrancy is not a core, what I would take to be a core doctrine found in the early creeds and such. This is a traditionally held doctrine, but with evidence, I think we can expand that doctrine. And I just don't see any problem with that. That helps my faith much more than taking some ridiculous position. I'm not saying everybody who holds the biblical inerrancy is ridiculous, but there are some ridiculous avenues it can go down if somebody takes it too strongly. But anyways, go ahead.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. So, my turn, cards on the table. I grew up a young earth creationist, like biblical literalist, pretty much. Um, and that is kind of part and parcel of the trad community. And I actually like really worry about the future me's. So what do I mean by that? I grew up trad. A lot. I'm going to say like the majority of people who are on kind of like Catholic YouTube today are trads, but they are immigrants to the trad culture. I was born into the trad culture. And I left trad culture. And I think that I left trad culture because of the hardline stances that you were just outlining. So the biblical inerrancy and the young earth creationism. And so I worry about the kids who are kind of going to be growing up in this trad culture now. Like there's going to be a lot more of me, I think, in 20 years from now. There's going to be a lot of people who grew up with this like really biblical literalist interpretation of things. And I think voices like yours are like super important in the Catholic Church right now because the trad tide is just washing like the entire church down this trad river. And like I really worry about the next generation. Because look at me, I didn't turn out that great. You know what I mean? So I think that your voice is super important, and I think that a faith like yours is a lot less fragile than a faith like mine clearly was. Because I mean, mine's gone, right? So I mean, I think that if you can be less hardline, you should be less hardline, because that's actually going to make your faith more resilient. Does that make sense? Like, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, and I didn't grow up. I mean, I've watched most of your videos, so I do know your background and such. Like, yeah, I didn't grow up trad, so it was like. But then when I got more into my faith, I started getting introduced. I don't know how to put it, but into those trad circles, and it was like, okay, I knew I needed to be careful with what I said about certain things, or certain people are going to start like looking at me funny, you're alienating me. And it was like, and at that point it was just like, well, where do you go? Like you have the moderate Catholic parishes that most of the people, or at least a lot of people, it's not really sure how committed they are to Catholicism, but there's not going to be like that insider outsider feeling. But then you go to like a really traditional parish and the people are really committed to their faith, but if you don't gel with their perspective, which I would consider a kind of fundamentalism for some of them at least, it's awkward. And it's like, no, I don't hold that perspective, so I would rather go to the church where the people are maybe most of the people aren't as committed, but at least they're not making me feel uncomfortable. Like I mean,
yeah.
So I've been there, and like, yeah, it's a problem, because the thing is, like, I think a lot of the voices in Catholic apologetics, like a lot of the top voices, are reasonable people, and a lot of them do try to try to meet both sides, and that's great. But there is a strong rad trad group that I agree with them on pretty much anything the church teaches. I agree with them on. The problem is that they apply this like very traditional mindset about certain doctrines like hell or biblical inerrancy, and then if people don't fit within that mold, then it's like, oh, you're a modernist liberal, like, oh, this is awful, look at all the problems this leads to. And I'm thinking, like, no, it really doesn't lead to those problems. The problems are the ones you're creating by forcing these views onto people and then acting like all these problems ensue, and then you go and debate atheists or whoever, and you lose because you're defending things that can't really be defended. So it's just like I have huge problems with it. Now, it's difficult to go about it because most people either don't care or they're not in a position that they feel comfortable embracing that perspective, and they don't want to maybe openly admit it because there are ramifications that come with it. But so I don't really know what to do about it, other than, you find somebody who sympathizes with that perspective, you can empathize with them. But
yeah. Do you ever get pushback? So I know that your channel is not super like Catholic specific. Your channel is more Christian specific. Like you don't get super into the Catholic weeds. You get into the Christian weeds, so to say. But do you ever get pushback from Catholics for talking to people like Camille Gregor?
Not really who I talk to. A lot of the apologetics channels will have on all kinds of people, so it's like, and my channel is not big enough. Like most people don't comment on my videos or acknowledge
Okay.
that I'm even doing anything. But I have gotten some pushback from people, saying like ease up on the don't suggest that somebody doesn't have to embrace biblical inerrancy, like basically defend biblical inerrancy, or just don't talk about it. And I mean that doesn't happen all the time, but it has happened, and it's like, well, I mean, I get where they're coming from. I don't want to offend people's sensibilities, and I wouldn't say, oh, you have to hold this view about the Bible. But I'm not shackling people, but I view some of these people as shackling people's minds. And like, what if it got to the point where somebody either has to leave the Catholic faith, or they can't even attend Catholic Mass and receive the sacraments with an easy conscience because they feel like they're believing in something ridiculous or blaspheming God? And I've been there where it's thought, both sides are bad. Like, but it's like, that's not a dilemma anybody should be in. So that's kind of my goal with apologetics in general, is like, I'm not really telling people what they have to believe, but at least be aware of what I take to be more reasonable alternatives. And at the end of the day, somebody has to make their decision. But like, yeah, I don't want to. As much I'm trying to reach Christians who are struggling with their faith, yeah, I want to debate atheists and stuff, and
Yeah.
well, if they change their mind, but at the same time, I'm not like trying to force people. But there are Christians who are struggling with their faith who want to be reasonable Christians, but they're being fed just a bunch of nonsense by
Yeah.
people that are basically just repeating stuff from other people, and it's all not very well founded, in
Mm-hmm.
my opinion.
Yeah. I've got a question for you. This is going to be something that that it's related to scholarship of the New Testament. It's also kind of still for me one of the reasons why I think that the church needs to change something that they said kind of infallibly. But before I get to that question, I just want to highlight this comment from Rosemary. She just kind of is agreeing with what we said. Rosemary said that so she grew up Novus Ordo. If she grew up Trad, she probably would have left earlier. And that's kind of what I was saying. Like, I may not have left if I wasn't so trad. And that's why I worry about like the next generation of Catholics. There's going to be a lot more trad kids like me. And then I also just want to say what's up to Nick. Glad you're able to make it. Um, but I've got a question for you. At the Council of Trent, there's some language, and I'm not going to quote it like perfectly word for word, but it goes something like this. Um, the authors of the New Testament wrote only that which God wanted them to write. Something like that. That's what. And Trent is supposed to be infallible. Um, I remember looking at that, and then I remember getting into like at first Bart Ehrman, but then more serious scholars like Father Raymond Brown, um, and the consensus that, and I'm going to pick on the Petrine epistles here. The consensus that the Petrine epistles were not written by Peter was a big sticking point. I'm going to say it still is a big sticking point for me. Why? Because both of the Petrine epistles start with Peter, servant of the Lord. Like he's saying, like, "Hey, I'm writing this. It's me, Peter." Modern scholarship says Peter didn't write that, and it's particularly bad for Second Peter. So I guess I'll ask you: how do you parse the language from Trent? So the authors of whoever the author of Second Peter was, God wanted them to write at the beginning. This is Peter writing. It's me. I'm Peter. But it probably wasn't Peter. So, you know, how do you wrestle with that?
Yeah. And for the record, I mean, I consider Bart Ehrman a pretty serious scholar, but yeah, Father Raymond Brown, I liked him. But yeah, anyways, yeah, I don't know if Trent used that language, but Vatican II certainly did. And
Okay.
that comes from Dei Verbum, Vatican II. And Vatican II, Dei Verbum was repeating language from Providentissimus Deus, I think is the document. So there was major documents. Now, there's a lot of debate. There was a lot of debate at Vatican II, and I think there was some meeting in the middle from the more liberal or more conservative minds of what that passage means. So it says, the human authors wrote down everything and only what Holy Spirit inspired them to do for the sake of our salvation. Now there's
Yes.
debate for the sake of our salvation. What does that mean? And you can read it one way, that it's a restrictive clause, meaning only for the sake of our salvation is the Bible inerrant, or you can read it as a purpose clause. God made the Bible inerrant so we can be saved. And it's unclear. So somebody like Raymond Brown would argue that it's the restrictive way. More conservative scholars would say, well, the original meaning, like in the earlier documents, was more of the purpose way. So we think it's that. Now, I don't know what was meant at Vatican II, but this document, or this book, it's not a document, but this book takes the restrictive view. So the church is, from what we could tell, is moving in more of that open-minded or liberal direction on this. And all I would say is its development of doctrine. The more we've learned about the Bible, with given history and archaeology and reflecting on theology, I think it's pushing us more towards adopting a restrictive view, even though the early church may not have taken that view. But I don't have a problem with that, because at Vatican II, there was a shift from salvation of non-Christians. Earlier popes had said that anybody outside the Catholic Church couldn't be saved, no salvation outside the church. Well, at Vatican II, they said, yeah, that's true, but what does it mean to be inside the church? Somebody could be, an anonymous Christian, was Karl Rahner's language. Somebody could be, baptism by desire. And they would say there's precedents for this, like in St. Thomas Aquinas had this kind of view already. Like, why can't we? So, I mean, if you look at like some of the church fathers, they did not necessarily have a really strong inerrantist view all the time, or at least it was flexible. They would use allegory when they needed to. Well, so I just don't, I do view it as development of doctrine, but I don't have a problem with that. Now, when it comes to something like the epistles, it's not just Peter's epistles, but like half of Paul's epistles are probably not written by Paul. Now, I would like to think that they wrote those. The evidence goes against that view. But I don't, now one out is to say that's okay because somebody was writing in their tradition, and that's not deceptive. That was a known practice. I kind of don't buy that, because people were worried about deception in the ancient world, at least as far as I've read on scholarship on that. Even in like Second Thessalonians, that seems to be implied that there's a worry about deception going on. But I don't really see it as a problem, and the Bible already has passages like in the Old Testament that I really don't think God endorses wholeheartedly. Like, you have laws allowing slavery and so on. Now, these make up a corpus, and it's not to say they can't serve an overall like organic purpose, but I don't think we should take that clause in the church, everything with holy and without error for the sake of our salvation. Like, we should take that in such a narrow way that it's like, or such a broad way that it's like, yeah, literally everything is exactly what God wanted. Like, that is going to be as implausible as young earth creationism. So if that's the route somebody's going to push somebody towards, yeah, I mean, I can't embrace that. But if you take a more liberal approach, that it's like, well, this is, what it means for the Bible to be inspired is that it's inspired to reveal a body of doctrine, and morals for us. And there could be some errors, and maybe there were people pretending to be other people and they're writing it. It still could be inspired writing. And I don't know, that's just how I look at it. And that's not going to satisfy everybody, but I think that squares the evidence better than the other alternative.
So I really like everything that you just said. And this was actually the first time I've heard about like the difference between like the restrictive view versus like the more conservative view. I'm probably unsurprisingly, I think that the restrictive view is going to be the more like I don't know what the right, like, it's the word like intellectual is coming to mind, and I think that's like gonna give off the wrong, but like it almost seems anti-intellectual to take the more conservative stance here, and it seems more intellectually honest to take the more restrictive view, because you're allowing for future revision, whereas the more conservative view, you're not. Nick is saying something to that effect here. Nick says, I've heard that one can separate divine inspiration of the spiritual from the earthly, so one can teach that Peter's epistles hold spiritual truths but not scientific truths. And I think Nick here might be saying that, like, Peter claiming to have written 2 Peter, it doesn't have like it perhaps spiritually it may as well have been written by Peter, even if it wasn't literally, perhaps. But then Nick goes on to say, but that could sound like a bit of a cop-out to the secular crowd. And yeah, and I mean, I think that this is what Caleb was just getting at. And Caleb, feel free to chime in here. But this kind of leads me to the next question, so feel free to respond to anything that I just said, as well as, what's the difference between I think the term is like progressive, or like church teaching evolving. What's the difference between that and church teaching just being wrong before? Like, why can't we admit that? Like, yeah, we said we were infallible, but we're not actually infallible. Like, we've figured out that we were never infallible, and that's okay. You know what I mean? Like why do we cling? It seems like we're doing a little bit of gymnastics to try to hold on to this infallibility, but we're in doing so we are getting real creative with our interpretation of some older texts.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean, I take a more flexible view on that. Like, there are certain things that I think doctrines it could not change on, or it would, I wouldn't be able to be a serious Catholic anymore. Like, if the church were to say, like, well, maybe the Trinity doesn't actually make sense, we don't have to believe that. Like, that's like a central claim. Like, I would not be able to be a Catholic anymore if the church all of a sudden said, I mean, I guess I'd have to see what exactly they mean by it, but there are certain claims that would just be going too far. I don't really view biblical inerrancy as one of those, and also the more like complex the doctrine is, like the more. Now the Trinity is difficult to grasp, but like the idea of God is one being, three persons, like that's the claim. Now biblical inerrancy, I guess the idea that the Bible is without error is a pretty simple claim. However, what's not so simple is, was the early church committed to that in being a restrictive view or not? Like, I mean, you've been looking at like the earliest statement of biblical inspiration I think exists in Second Timothy. It's really not clear. It just says that the Bible, or not even referring to the New Testament, but just Old Testament, is useful for teaching and training. And it's like, that really is not a strong inerrantist view. I'm not sure that Jesus and Paul were even strong inerrantists. Maybe they were, but it's very unclear to me. So you have this very general doctrine that I don't see why there couldn't be reasonable room for development. And that's quite different than if somebody were to say Jesus isn't God. Like, that just seems like a complete turnabout. That's not chiseling down a general claim. That's just a complete turnabout, and it's a complete turnabout about a very central claim that the church has been professing. I'm not sure that's the same for biblical or inerrancy. So, I guess to answer twofold, I think there can be some like seed form of a doctrine that can take development, and that's okay. And and it's kind of intuitional, but it's like, how far is too far? Like, if the church tomorrow said, well, we aren't using the Bible anymore, that would be going too far. But if church were to say, well, maybe inerrancy doesn't work like this, even though some documents have kind of supposed that they were, but we didn't know as much about archaeology and scholarship and all this other stuff. So it's kind of like with salvation of non-Christians. It's like, or non-Catholics, like that has changed some, but I view it's not like the general idea, like people who are saved through the church. It's just, what does it mean to be a part of the church? Well, there's some unclarity there. So that's kind of how I look at it. Now, not everybody will agree with me, of course, but
yeah, like the trads by and large wouldn't agree with that, but yeah, the trads do what they want to do.
But most trads haven't really thought about the issue. I mean, I know that
true.
because I've talked to them and they have no idea about it. Now, some of them take a hardline stance, but these are also sometimes are people who have a career invested in taking a hardline stance. So you have to take some of what they say with a grain of salt. Now, I'm not saying anybody who's a trad who's who's famous or whatever is dishonest, but I'm just saying you do have to take some of it with a grain of salt. I'm pretty confident that Pope Francis doesn't take a hardline stance on biblical inerrancy, and I'm pretty confident John Paul II and Pope Benedict didn't either.
I would agree.
Implicitly. Now, they didn't come out and say it, but they were also navigating these difficult waters, and they're trying not to offend people's sensibilities. But now, if you go back to most of the popes, probably most of the popes, though, didn't have access to or study biblical scholarship, and like, so yeah.
Biblical scholarship's like 200 years old.
Yeah.
So any of the popes before 200 years ago just plain old didn't have access to any biblical scholarship, like any like significant biblical scholarship, like at all. And then even popes from like the scholarly consensus on so many topics has shifted drastically since like the 1970s even, so I actually view Vatican II as like way ahead of its time, to be honest. Like And it's so funny that I've done such a complete 180 on Vatican II. As a trad, I was like, Vatican what? Like, there was no Vatican II. There was, there's just one Vatican Council. Um, and then once I was, once the damage was done, I began to appreciate Vatican II, if that makes sense. Um, okay, I could talk about this kind of stuff with you all day, but I had a couple other topics if you don't mind jumping over to another topic.
Yeah.
Um, I've been watching a bunch of your videos, and you've done a bunch of back and forths with the atheist YouTuber Emerson Green on the problem of evil. Um, I will tell you that you and I probably agree in as much as I don't think the problem of evil is actually a good reason to be an atheist. Um, but I kind of wanted to hand the microphone over to you for a second and just say, like, hey, why do you think the problem of evil seems to be such like a hot topic, and why do you think it's not as effective as other people might think it is?
So I actually kind of disagree with your first part. I actually think if somebody were to be an atheist, I'm not encouraging people to be, but I think that is the one argument I could see giving justification. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't have decent responses. I think there's no knockdown philosophical argument for anything that somebody couldn't come up with a reasonable enough response to it. It's always going to be somebody's intuitions and judgments. But I do think the problem of evil is pretty difficult. Just intuitively, it's like, well, if God is sustaining the universe in existence, even if you don't think he's all powerful, like that can be an open question. But I mean, sustaining the universe in existence, like that's bare minimum. Like that's pretty powerful. He can take the universe out of existence or alter it, presumably, and he's all loving. He loves everybody. He's gonna end suffering someday, according to Christians. Why would he allow extreme suffering to go on? Like it's and the responses given are oftentimes pretty bad. Like you can poke holes in them pretty easily right away. And I don't want that to be the case. I wish it was like, oh, this is very easy. I can just show the flaw. It just falls apart. I don't think that is the case. I do think you can give plausible responses, and I've worked on it for a long time to come up with. And I don't really want to debate it at length because it would. I mean, unless you want to, but it would take a while to hash it out. But I have a video, and I've done a number of discussions, and I have a document on my community page, etc. I go through a lot of it. I do think there is a plausible theodicy that I've developed, and there are some other decent ones too, but it's not easy. And I mean, and even when you look at statements from the popes and you look at the Bible, it seems like the Christian witness is to acknowledge that suffering and God, there is a conflict. It's not so when like Christian apologists will be like, oh, that's so weak, like you're just presuming to judge God and you're acting like you're God. And it's like, that's just totally irrelevant. Like, that's just not even what's going on. So I really push back on Christians who are dismissive of the problem and then are critical of atheists for raising the problem. But again, obviously I don't think it's a knockdown argument, or I wouldn't be a committed Catholic. But I do think it's challenging, though.
Yeah. So Nick brings up the free will defense. Um, I am not moved by the argument from evil, but I'm likewise not moved by the free will defense for the argument of evil. I'll tell you why, Caleb, and then maybe you want to respond. So I guess first I'll just very briefly I'll say I'm not moved by the argument from evil because as a nominalist I don't think that evil actually exists. So like I don't really think that there is like this like universal of evil. So I don't get really all bent out of shape over the fact that like the universe works in like a deterministic way. I do think it's like odd. Like I would think it would be odd for a god to set up a deterministic universe like this. But I don't think it's like impossible or anything like that. It just, I don't know. Maybe I just have like funny intuitions, but like my intuition doesn't lead me to think that it's like weird that we would have this deterministic universe. But also that deterministic universe, like it kind of takes the force away from evil. It likewise takes the force away from like any kind of free will defense. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I don't think the free will defense on its own is enough to respond to the problem of evil because it's not going to at least plausibly cover like natural disasters, or why God would allow somebody to commit tons of horrible
Hmm.
crimes against people without stopping. But I do think it's part of a good response, like, or at least I do incorporate free will into a response. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that it seems entirely plausible to me too that God could create, like, it's not metaphysically impossible for God to create a world in which there is free will and in which there is no evil. Um, and one such world, I think most Christians would agree already exists and is heaven. I think most Christians, not just Catholics, would argue that in heaven there is free will and there is no evil. So to me, free will just doesn't seem like a get out of jail free card for the problem of evil.
Right, on its own, yeah, it's not. I do think that's where I get sometimes frustrated. Where I'm not saying you're doing this or anybody, but some people I've interacted with, they'll be like, "Oh, well, the free will defense fails," and then like just kind of move on. And it's like, well, depends. There's more than one, first of all. But assuming I get what you're coming from, it's like, well, you're right. I don't think it works as a total explanation, but if you incorporate it into a broader explanation, or use free will as part of the explanation, I think that it can factor in. Is kind of my position. But I don't think though that, like, I don't think evil exists. Like, as I take the privation view, but I don't even really care if somebody's committed to the privation view of evil. We can just throw that out. The question then is though, why does God allow people to suffer or creatures to suffer? And evil doesn't have to play into that at all. And it's still a problem. Why do people suffer? Why doesn't God stop it? Why has He created a universe where people can suffer so much? And again, I think it's a difficult problem. I think it has plausible responses, but I don't fault somebody for finding that persuasive, because I mean it's bothered me. And the more and more I looked into and thought about the responses I was seeing Christian apologists, philosophers, whoever make, and how weak they seemed, it really bothered me. And it was like, this is the best that people have to respect. Now there is skeptical theism that commenter brought up, and yeah, that's I think that's fair. If somebody says we don't know the reasons, I think that is fair. It doesn't give me a lot of confidence though when somebody appeals to mystery. So, and I'm not saying that's all that skeptical theism is. It's more technical, like saying like, well, we're not in a position to know, and like we shouldn't expect to be. But it doesn't give me a lot of confidence. So yeah, it's always possible there's something we're not seeing, sure, but it seems like what I am seeing makes me uncomfortable. That's kind
Yeah,
of how I look
yeah.
at it.
Tell me more about your theodicy.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I can tell you about it. Like, I would recommend if somebody's gonna like really want to pick it apart, I would recommend they read the document I posted on my community tab, because I go through a lot of like pretty much all the objections that I've come across. But basically, try to take the free will defense, but broaden it a little bit so it can account for natural evils, and try to explain why God doesn't intervene more. So I say like, well, if God's creating the universe, it's plausibly the case that everything is interconnected by a system of physical laws, and that allows for causal interactions and such. And it's also plausibly the case that if God were to create the universe that He wants, then that entire system needs to be conformed to His intellect and will. So it needs to operate exactly as He wants. And that both of those claims seem plausible, but it also, to my mind, seems plausible that God doesn't want people to sin. He wants people to love Him. He wants them to love others. But it also seems plausible to my mind that God wouldn't force somebody to love Him and love other people. But if that's the case, then it seems to, in my mind, undermine the starting point. So the system needs to not be fully conformed to His intellect and will. Well, once you acknowledge that, then all bets are off. Now we have a partially conformed system, but a partially conformed system can have laws that can lead to things God doesn't want. That's the general gist of it. Now, there are a lot of objections that people have made to it and responses I've made back, and I think it does hold up. But, I mean, there are reasonable objections. Now, okay, and just to cap it off, I think God will end suffering because eventually He'll conform the system of laws of our universe to His intellect and will, and that will obliterate suffering. But people will have an opportunity to freely respond to God. So that's why you have this interim period. Now, and also to give a little more context, so I was kind of welding the free will defense with, so Thomas Ord is a philosopher, theologian, who argues basically that God is limited by, like, He can't interfere with the laws of nature. They kind of extend
Hmm.
from God, and this has to do with God's love. And I found that kind of plausible, but it didn't really explain how God's gonna ever end suffering. So I was like, well, maybe there's a way we can like weld these two views together, and that's kind of what I did with the theodicy. Now, some people don't understand the theodicy, or some people do understand it, but they object anyways. Now, the latter is fine, but a lot of people don't understand it, and then they raise objections that I've already responded to thousands of times, and that's fine if they're a good faith actor and not just trying to straw man me. But I'm not sure with a lot of people. But people I talk to, everybody's come on my channel has been fine. It's some people that or just drive-by commenters. Oh, you said this. Oh, I'm debunking you right now. Goodbye. Like,
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of patience with that, but
Yeah.
I'll talk to anybody though.
Yeah. Quick question for you. So, and you'll have to forgive my unfamiliarity with your work. I'm sure that this is addressed, but you said that you think that God will end suffering. I assume that you're not including suffering in hell in there, right? Like you imagine that the suffering in hell will be eternal, right?
So there's a few points there. So one, I am a hopeful universalist. I do
Okay.
think it's compatible with Catholicism. So I do
Bishop
think,
Barron style, kind of.
right, and like Father, I'm trying to think of his name, Rooney, who's on Twitter a lot, and he doesn't defend hopeful universe, like it's not his view necessarily, but he argues that it's compatible with Catholicism, and he's a very conservative Dominican, like. But anyways, so I do hope everybody will be saved, and I think that it's reasonable to hold that view, but I don't know it, and I wouldn't say people should be certain that it'll be saved. So I do think it's compatible with Catholicism, but I also think a kind of annihilationism could be compatible with Catholicism. I've defended it before. The church has never condemned annihilationism, but I'll admit it's not the tradition. So anyways, like I've kind of said, well, maybe you could hold to everything but like, and I call it semi-annihilationism. So like maybe God keeps their soul in existence, resurrects their body, but because they're completely out of union with God, they have no experience whatsoever. So they're just like completely asleep or whatever you want to call it. And they're technically not annihilated, but they're also not suffering. And I'm not saying that is the case, and I'm not saying there's any traditional support for this view, but there's nothing that rules it out.
Yeah.
Obviously, we don't really know, so why can't that be an option? So, like, a lot of times the pushback I'll get from people is like saying, well, that just sounds like annihilationism. And they aren't understanding the context. Yes, I'm trying to find a way for Catholics to be an annihilationist, basically. And I'm not committing to it being the case. I'm saying this is a possibility. So if this causes somebody concerns, they're worried that somebody's gone to hell and they're being tortured forever, I would say, well, maybe not. This is still bad. This isn't like what we should want, but this isn't somebody being tortured forever. So that's some ways I would respond to it. I don't know if I have more to add on that, but yeah, the idea that God would torture somebody forever is pretty. It just makes problems for somebody not having cognitive dissonance, or wanting to not have cognitive dissonance. Like, and the fact that like trads like to like play that up is like disturbing, because it's like this isn't helping anybody like want to be a Christian or change their life or love God. Like this is just driving people away. Now I grant there are people like, yeah, I've gone to confession out of fear of hell. Like, yeah, I get it, but it doesn't make for a good long-term like healthy faith to play up. Sure, it can drive people to want to change in the short term, and I'm not saying like it can't, but ultimately at the end of the day we want to present God as a loving being, and that's just not loving to think that God is, and it honestly has very weak biblical support. So yeah, there's a lot I could say, but anyways.
There's a particular quote that some of the trads in my life used to love to quote from the Summa. So Aquinas writes like, is it not awful that, or how could a mother be happy in heaven knowing that her son is in hell, or something like that? Like, and Aquinas actually writes that the saints in heaven will delight at the suffering of those in hell because they see that it is just. They will have the beatific vision, and so they will see they'll see God's perfect justice, and they'll see the suffering in hell and be like, this is perfectly just. This makes me quite happy to see all this suffering in hell because they deserved it. I always found that pretty disturbing. And just like Nick, I totally get the appeal of universalism. And universalism is, as the kids say, based. But Yeah, I'm with you there. I find the leaning into the suffering in hell to be like really, really disturbing. Um, and I don't understand how anybody isn't a hopeful universalist. And some people are definitely not hopeful universalists. Like some people don't even hope that it's like some
Well,
people
some
will.
people, they think you're going against the church teaching and God's word, but I
Yeah.
don't. I mean, if anything, like I think the New Testament teaches hopeful universalism. The God's plan is that all will be saved. There's no indication other than there's a verse that may imply Judas wasn't saved, but that's debated. And other than that, it's like there's nothing that suggests that we
And
can know how many. Okay, there is one verse that there are. Okay, there is that one verse in Matthew that may imply that a majority will be lost. I wouldn't interpret it that way, but it's like people cling to a verse like that. It's like you're taking one verse and you're making this entire perspective out of that
um
instead of saying like maybe we have an unclear verse and let's bring everything else and like siphon that one verse off.
yeah, and I'm gonna argue that a lot of this like traditional view of hell stuff doesn't even come from the Bible. It comes from like things like private revelation, like Fatima, when Our Lady of Fatima said something to the effect of people will fall to hell like snowflakes from the sky due to the sin of impurity. She was talking specifically about the sin of impurity at Fatima, but I think people will take private revelation like that, which the church has never said has any authority. Like you're free to disbelieve any kind of private revelation that you want. But people will hear stuff like that and they'll be like, "Yep, okay, traditional view of hell is 100%. That's exactly it. This is dogmatic for me." When it's not dogmatic. At least that's my experience
Somebody
anyway.
and somebody can have a traditional view of hell where they think it's like I mean, I think most Catholics who've thought about it probably take like a C.S. Lewis type approach, like in the Great Divorce, like hell is like not the best place, but it's like people aren't being tortured, but it's like not a place you want to be because you're not like you're lonely and such, and like that's definitely better than eternal torture. I don't know that God would allow that to go on forever. Like that's kind of the difficulty still, but it's much better than that the God would allow people to be tortured forever. But yeah, there are different perspectives. But again, most people don't think about how to reconcile the issue. They either just accept what they think is the doctrine, or they don't think about it at all, and they don't really care what the church teaches. And that's most people, at least in my impression. But yeah, the Fatima, like, yeah, I don't have a position on whether Fatima is authentic or not, but I mean, any revelation is going to be filtered. At least it's plausible that any revelation, even if you think it's a legitimate revelation from God, it's going to be filtered through that person's psyche. Like, I don't, even if the children did see that vision, that wouldn't, even if I was convinced of that, it wouldn't mean that that vision itself is not filtered through their own psyche, that they're then, I mean, there's just so many unknowns to develop a doctrine that's going to drive, that's not required by the church, or not even a doctrine, an interpretation of a doctrine. It's not required by the church. It's going to drive people away from having faith in God because of a private revelation. I mean, that's just ridiculous. I mean, it is Gnosticism if you take it too far, that you're placing private revelations above what the church officially has taught, what the Bible teaches. Now, there are different ways to interpret what the Bible teaches. I'm not denying that, but it's not clear the Bible teaches that view of hell. So it's like, yeah, I have huge problems with that. But
Yeah, and Nick even brings up here that he remembers that the term translated as hell is the garbage dump. So you're talking about Gehenna, um, and so what's funny is I was just reading about this morning because I wanted to look up the actual word Gehenna in the New Testament, because the New Testament, of course, is written in Greek. Gehenna is not a Greek word. Gehenna is a Hebrew word, or maybe Aramaic. I'm not actually sure. The word used in the New Testament isn't even Gehenna. It's a Hellenized version of the Valley of something. And the Valley of something is where Gehenna was. And so everybody just translate this Hellenized Aramaic word as Gehenna, even though it's not like a one-to-one translation. And then some people translate Gehenna as hell, even though like that's a real stretch. Like we're translating from Greek to like Hebrew, Aramaic, whatever it is, to English, and we're winding up with hell. So very good point, Nick. Yeah. So you're right. The New Testament only ever uses 3 different words for hell. More often than not, they actually use the Greek word Hades, which just means the underworld. They'll use the word Gehenna as well, and then they'll also use the word I forget the last one.
It's Tartarus.
Tartarus, that's what it is. Thank you.
I think that's used one time, like in First Peter.
Yeah, it's not even used in any of the Gospels. It's only used in First Peter or something like that. And then the Old Testament is constantly using Sheol, which just means the grave. So I do think that the pop culture version of heaven and hell is quite different than the biblical understanding of heaven and hell. And and I don't know if you might disagree with me here, but I'm even going to say that like the biblical version of heaven and hell isn't even super clear. Like it's everybody likes to talk as if like heaven and hell is super clearly spelled out and stuff like that. When I read the New Testament and the Old Testament, I don't think that their vision of the afterlife is like super clear to me. It's not, Dante's Inferno did a whole lot to cement hell into our like collective psyche. But this pre-Dante's Inferno conception of hell is just very, very weird and different. And it doesn't at all seem to be related to the pop culture version that we see today. I don't know if you disagree with me. You might think it's clearer than I do.
No, I mean, I agree. We aren't given a lot. I mean, we're told heaven is, some people debate that New Testament even teaches like a disembodied heaven, and there's the final resurrection of the dead to life with God, and then there's the final resurrection to life apart from God, and with God is great, and without God it's not. And I think that's mostly the extent. Now, I do think there is a disembodied afterlife before the resurrection. I think there's a little bit of evidence that that's the teaching. Of course, the teaching, there could be different views, but that does seem to be suggested a couple of places in the New Testament, and it is what the Catholic Church teaches. But yeah, some Christians don't think that. They just think there's a resurrection, and yeah, we don't really know all that it involves, and the Bible doesn't tell us a lot. The Church hasn't proclaimed a lot of specifics, so when people claim to know specifics that they've received this from somewhere, I'm very questionable, or don't place a lot of stock in it.
Yeah. We've got less than 10 minutes till we hit the 1 hour mark. Do you mind if I switch over to questions? I've got 2 pulled up in the chat that they're both going to be more aimed at you. They're going to be both more aimed at you. Okay, so question from Nick. I'm curious, what's Caleb's thought on the B theory of time and the idea that the Big Bang was not a true beginning and that the universe is partially eternal? Caleb, you take this one entirely because I am so unfamiliar with the difference between A theory and B theory of time that I'm not going to weigh in at all.
Yeah, like A theory and B theory refer to like whether time really passes or not, and I'm not really that more interested in, sometimes it's called presentism versus four-dimensionalism, or eternalism, and I think those are better terms. So the idea that is only the present real, or is past, present, future simultaneously real. Now, my intuitions tell me presentism is true, but theology and maybe modern physics suggest something like four-dimensional eternalism is true, which is a really interesting topic. So I do lean towards that four-dimensionalist perspective, but it is a little bit hard to wrap one's mind around. So with that being the case, if past, future, present are simultaneously real, but we just experience events one at a time, then technically, yeah, the Big Bang is as real as right now is. But so yeah, the universe would be eternal in some sense, but that doesn't really bother me because it would still be sustained by God. It couldn't exist without God, so it doesn't bother me. Now, some people will argue that if you take an eternalist, four-dimensionalist view of time, that's in conflict with creation ex nihilo. I don't agree with that, but under certain views of reading it, you could make that case. I don't defend the Kalam cosmological argument isn't big to me, so that sometimes factors in too. I'm not big on that, but anyways, that's kind of my
thought. Okay. This next one is actually a good question from Rosemary. This is actually something that I was talking about earlier today in the live stream of some Pints with Aquinas stream or something like that. So Rosemary says, the discussion of the expansion of what is required dogma has me thinking about the phrase, the church will become smaller. Maybe the church will become smaller is actually better applied to the number of dogmatic claims rather than the number of the faithful. I think that's a really interesting way to think about the phrase. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I mean, people generally use that phrase or meaning like people are going to leave and then they'll come back stronger or something like that. And I think that can happen now. Um, so I wouldn't, and I personally would not endorse the idea that like the church dogmas are going to disappear or we're going to, but there can be development of how to understand them, which may allow for some broader perspectives. And that, so as far as that goes, like, yeah, that could be the case. Again, I think there are some doctrines like not, I mean, I wouldn't say any doctrines can be jettisoned or any dogmas can be jettisoned, but there could be new interpretations of those doctrines and dogmas that can allow for maybe more people to find the church acceptable and plausible. And so those are my thoughts.
I'm going to kind of tell you what I wrote on that Pints with Aquinas chat, and then just get your thoughts. I could totally see, and this is just conjecture, but I could totally see the Catholic Church kind of going the way of Judaism, in as much as the church, in wider culture, fades from power, so to speak, becoming mostly a cultural institution, but retaining some kind of orthodox base who will never totally fade away. So by this, I mean, there are still very Orthodox Jews who go to temple and who follow all the laws and are, just as faithful as Jews were thousands of years ago. However, by and large, Judaism is more of a culture today than it is a religion. And I don't think a whole lot of people will disagree with me. And I think this is evidenced by the fact that it's not at all an oxymoron to talk about like a Jewish atheist. So I wonder if like later in our lifetimes, it won't at all be an oxymoron to talk about a Catholic atheist. And sometimes I almost describe myself that way. I refrain from doing it because the Catholic Church is not there yet. So I do currently think it's an oxymoron to talk about a Catholic atheist, but it might not be an oxymoron forever. And that's kind of where I saw Rosemary's question going. What do you think? Do you disagree? Or do you kind of reluctantly agree with me that like you wish this wasn't the case, but this appears to be the way demographics are going?
I mean, I think with like Judaism, like since there is a like ethnic background as well, like if somebody's has Hebrew lineage, then they could still be part of that, and then even though they don't believe, but with Catholicism there isn't that aspect. So I wouldn't say somebody couldn't call themselves a Catholic atheist if they wanted, but that's where I feel like it is like a strictly theological term, although there is a culture and community to it aspect as well. I don't think that obviously, as a committed Catholic, I'm not going to commit myself to the view that like, oh, the church is going to become like very small and it's just going to be like a few people or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of that we do have that term like cafeteria Catholics, so people who don't really like subscribe or even really know what the church teaches, but they're still going to church and they would still call themselves Catholic. Maybe they don't even go to church, but they were raised Catholic and they'll call themselves Catholic. So there's a lot of people like that. But that's I guess all I would say.
Cool. Okay. I got one more question for me, and I'll take it and I'll ask your thoughts on my response. But so from the year of the Lord, AD, that's how I'm choosing to interpret your name. How do atheists make sense of miracles in the Catholic Church? So I don't, this is probably not surprising. I don't think that there are miracles. If we define miracles in any kind of like supernatural sense. So I have yet to find something that has like knocked me off my feet in terms of like, yes, this is demonstrably a miracle. There are some that make me go like, wow, I have no idea what happened there. But that is a different thing to say, yes, confirmed miracle versus I don't know what happened there. Let me kind of draw two different examples to tell you what I mean. So I did a pretty deep dive on Eucharistic miracles a few months ago. I looked at 3, Lanciano, Buenos Aires, and Tixla. The same scientist worked on Buenos Aires and Tixla, and this guy's work was really bad, really shoddy. They couldn't agree on what kind of body tissue this sample was. Some scientists said it was skin, some said it was heart tissue. They couldn't make a determination of like any kind of genetics, but they did claim that it was blood type AB. I have no idea how they said that the blood type was AB if there wasn't enough stuff left to get a genetic sequencing from it. The lead scientist on the case proposed that the reason that there was no genetic material was because Jesus actually only has half of a human genetic sequence because he doesn't have an earthly father, which is preposterous. Because if Jesus was human, then he had human DNA. If you only had 50% of your DNA, you're not a human. You're something else entirely because you only have like half of each chromosome. So first of all, that fetus would never develop. Like that would not grow into a human being. So it just makes kind of like no sense. But that's an example of a miracle that I'm not at all moved by. But we were just talking about Fatima. Excuse me. I do think that Fatima is interesting. I don't think that something miraculous actually happened. And I think that I can even get most Catholics to agree with me that at best we're talking about a massive illusion. Because no scientists recorded the sun moving. Like it wasn't seen in other countries. Yes, some people claim that they saw it like, several towns away and stuff like that. But by and large, nobody noticed the sun moving. So at best, we're talking about this miracle being an illusion for a crowd of thousands of people, which would still be impressive. But it's not an actual miracle of the sun dancing. It's a miracle of an illusion of the sun dancing. Secondly, there were thousands of people there, the vast majority of whom said nothing. We don't have records from the thousands upon thousands of people that were there. We do have records from tens of people who said that they saw stuff, maybe even hundreds of people who saw stuff. But we also have records of tens or hundreds of people who said that they saw nothing, including a Catholic priest. There was a Catholic priest there who was like, yes, nothing happened. We have record of this. So, but regardless, it's weird. Like, we have thousands of people who all claimed that the sun danced. And yes, like they said that the sun moved in different ways. Some said that it swooped. Some said that it just radiated funny colors. Like, they're different stories. But regardless, there was some kind of there was this delirium on the crowd, and that alone is super mysterious. That's about as far as you're gonna get me, though. Is that there's some super mysterious stuff that I can't properly explain. But seeing as how everything in this universe seems to work according to the laws of physics, I'm just super skeptical whenever somebody says, yes, the laws of physics were broken on this day. Because, in the same way that I'm pretty sure that the sun is going to come up tomorrow, I'm pretty sure that like the speed of light is the speed of light. And I'm pretty sure that, force is equal to mass times acceleration today, and force is going to be equal to mass times acceleration tomorrow. So that's kind of my stance on miracles. Probably a little bit like anticlimactic, but that's what it is for me. And I'm not an atheist, but I'm an agnostic. So I feel like I fit the question fine enough. Kayla, what do you think?
I just saw that. I'll tell you in a second. But anyways, just something funny that I'm getting a call from Franciscan University right now, literally.
Do you want to take it? We can end.
No, they're asking for donations. Oh. But I just find it so ironic. But anyways. Yeah, I mean, I don't rest my faith on miracles that people have claimed to have seen. I mean, it's possible. Yeah, I mean, Fatima, in the main Marian apparitions, Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Lourdes, like those. I find those first two, or Lourdes and Guadalupe, to be more plausible to me than Fatima, just theologically speaking, because the message of Fatima I find difficult. But but yeah, I don't rest my faith on it. I think it's possible. I think God does work miracles. They're not usually fantastical things. They're like things that, I like the phrase that has been around in the church for a long time. It may go back to Aquinas, but I don't know that nature, grace builds on nature. So yeah, God does work within the world, but it's over a long period of time. Usually, it's not usually
Sorry.
instantaneous. So when somebody says like some really instantaneous, like fantastical thing happened, like I'm skeptical. I'm not saying it couldn't have. I'm not going to rest my faith on it. A lot of times the claims aren't true, or that person's interpretation. It's possible. I don't rest my faith on it, so that's all I'll say. Like, yeah, there are some claims that are plausible, but I don't. I haven't, and I also haven't looked into them a ton because it doesn't interest me that much because it's not like I should be a Catholic based on something like that, and I shouldn't not be a Catholic based on it being false. So it doesn't really interest me that much. If that happened for that person, that's great, but that's kind of how it is.
I 100% agree that miracles should not be a make or break for anybody. Um, Unfortunately, it seems like sometimes they are. Like some people have crazy devotions to Fatima in particular. Um, or some people have a crazy devotion to like I don't know, like pick like a saint or something, maybe like Padre Pio or something like that. And like I think that there are some people where like if you were able to convince them that Fatima wasn't veridical, I think that they would lose their faith. And I think that's like weird because I feel like your faith shouldn't rest on Fatima. Um,
Right. Yeah. And I do think miracles do occur like every mass. I think the bread and wine really do become the body and blood of Christ. Now I look at that as a natural miracle in the same way
ooh,
that God has created gravity. I think he's created a certain law that like once Christ institutes the priesthood, this is going to take place. Now it's not empirical. We can't prove it like with the senses. So I'm not committed to like the miracle of Lanciano, and I'm not saying it's not real. I haven't looked into it, but I'm not committed to that. But I do really believe the bread or wine become the body and blood of Christ. We just can't detect it with our senses. Now I know you have a lot of videos and stuff on that, but I do think there are some conceptual difficulties in how to understand it. But yeah, it's what I mean.
yeah. Um, just real quick for Nick, bending a law of physics is breaking a law of physics. Just you know, like that's how it works. Like if you altered the speed of light in a vacuum, even a hair, you're breaking the laws of physics. Like there is no such thing as just bending a law. Like any bending of a law of nature is breaking it. Um, and I think that like a lot of people who aren't as like so I took upper level maths and sciences, particularly physics and chemistry because of my engineering degree. And it's super super cool how like I view certain like base level laws of physics, like the laws of thermodynamics, to be like almost. I'm not going to say equally. I'm going to say almost equally as fundamental as things like the logical laws, because they just appear to be the like brute and the way that the universe works. Like, why is X equal to X? I don't know. It's just the way the universe works. And like, um, why does entropy always increase? Like, I don't know. That's just the way the universe works. So I view them as like shockingly similar. I will knock down the um like laws like entropy and stuff like that, like a peg below the logical laws, because I can imagine a world where like the speed of light is different. I can't even imagine a world where X doesn't equal X because like I'm not sure what that would even look like. That's neither here nor there. Um, Also, Caleb, with regard to like transubstantiation and the miracle, did you call it? And I don't. So we're already over our hour, but you called it a natural miracle. Is that what you said?
Yeah, and I mean that was just a term. Like that's I'm not committed to that term per se, but just like in that it's regularly occurring. Like I think every mass, every time the priest says the words of consecration, the bread and wine literally become Christ's flesh and blood, just not detectable to our senses. So it's as regular as if you were to drop a pencil and it falls to the floor. However, it is a miracle because it's something that is um, instituted by Christ within the world. Like it's not something that we're going to be able to pin down with mathematics and observation. So it's a miracle in that sense, but it is natural in the sense that it is regularly occurring. Now it may go against, it may require revising certain laws. Um, but again, like this is just going beyond like something I'm going to be able to map out, or anybody's going to be able
Mm.
to. So yeah, and I would, yeah, with your statement, I mean, this will take us into a wider discussion, but
Yes,
I
it
do
will.
think, yeah, the laws of logic, though, yeah, I do think they're inviolable. Not even God could violate them, because I don't think they're laws per se. They're just descriptions of things that are conceptually necessarily true. But the laws of physics, I do think God could step in and change those. So I think he could change those. They just aren't usually violated. So they're very, without. I mean, God has set up the world to operate that way, and unless he changes something, they're going to keep operating that way. Um, so, anyways, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I would love to do another conversation with you sometime, either here or on your channel, where we go deeper into transubstantiation. I had on our tentative agenda like nominalism. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little happy that we didn't get there, only because I've been talking about nominalism like to death. And I much preferred the conversation that we did have, but there's so much there too. So I would love to have another conversation with you sometime, again on this show or on yours. Where we can delve into that further. AD, if you take all the weird stuff collectively happening within context of the Catholic Church, I agree that it gives you more to consider. Consider being the key word. I don't think that anybody's faith should rest on these miracles. I think that's probably a recipe for a bad time. With that, I've kept you 10 minutes longer than I told you I would. I have one final question for you. It's the forever last question. What's new with you? What are you working on? What are you excited about? And where can we find you?
Yeah. Well, I have a YouTube channel, Dry Apologist, and then I have a Twitter handle, Dry Apologist. And yeah, I mean, I'm active on there, but I don't really have like future plans. I mostly just do discussions when people are willing to talk with me, and I make videos when I feel inspired, but I don't have any plan. I don't. It's just
Yeah, same. I fly by the seat of my pants. Okay, cool. Well, Caleb, it was awesome. Thank you so much for coming on, for fielding all these questions, and for staying over. Really appreciate it. This was a fantastic discussion, and I can't wait to do it again sometime.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, everybody.